Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night.
I arrived at Cypress Hollow a week ago, my first posting in the state after 6 years patrolling more conventional forests. The boardwalks were slick with the morning fog curling along the cypress knees like smoke rising from wet soil. Harlan, the senior ranger, met me at the gate. He didn't speak much, but his eyes tracked the water as if it were alive, calculating. "You'll learn fast," he said with a nod. I didn't question it, though the words carried a weight I couldn't measure. On my first night, I followed the main trail, flashlight slicing through the mist in narrow arcs. Frogs croaked in uneven clusters, the water sloshed against the wooden piers, and somewhere deep, a bird I didn't recognize let out a single sharp cry, then silence. I felt the first stirrings of unease, not fear exactly, but awareness, the sense of being watched by something I could not see. I told myself it was new territory, nerves, imagination. By the second night, the swamp seemed to respond. My radio hissed, not random static, but a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Fragments of words filtered through, my own voice slowed, flattened, like it had passed through water before reaching me. I spun toward the sound. Nothing, only the water, rippling with no wind. I adjusted my patrols, keeping close to the boardwalk, recording everything with meticulous notes. On the third night, the pressure began. Not a threat I could see, not direct danger, just weight, subtle, pressing against my boots, spreading through the wooden planks, settling into the mud. It was like the swamp itself was measuring me. I understood instinctively. Cypress Hollow had rules I had not yet learned. The ground, the water, even the air carried intent. I couldn't fight it. I could only move through it carefully, silently, aware that the swamp noticed me as much as I noticed it. By the fourth night, I began noticing patterns. Small things at first. A branch broke in at a strange angle, though the trail was clear. Footprints in the mud that didn't match any known animal. I followed them a few paces, only to see them vanish abruptly, smoothed over as if the ground remembered differently than I did. The water itself seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking. Shadows that weren't cast by trees, but by shapes that bent the edges of perception. Harlan didn't comment, only observed, his eyes reflecting the dim light of my flashlight in a way that made me uneasy. I realized I was walking on a living memory, a swamp that held grudges, recollections, and patience. On the fifth night, the first voice came. Not through the radio, not through any technology, but whispered on the wind. It mimicked something familiar, a fragment of my own speech from earlier that day, a word I hadn't said aloud. I froze. The voice stopped. I called out, my own voice sounding thin and unsure. Silence returned, heavier than before. I logged the time, the position, my pulse rising, though I knew there was no one there. When I tried to rationalize it in the morning, I told myself animals could mimic sounds, water could carry echoes, but even the logs didn't feel convincing. I had entered a place that existed outside my normal understanding of reality. By the sixth night, I began to suspect I was not alone in a way that mattered. There were presences here I could not name, only feel. When I returned to camp, Harlan's gaze lingered on me longer than necessary. He said nothing, but I knew he had felt it too, or something like it. I started taking different patrols, breaking my routes, testing how the swamp responded. Every time I deviated from the boardwalk, the pressure underfoot changed. Mud shifted under my boots, water pulsed against my ankles with unnatural cadence. A log that had always been stable suddenly gave way when I stepped on it,
though nothing else in the area had moved. I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of my flashlight's beam, elongated just beyond clear recognition. Once I swore I saw a figure standing across a flooded clearing. I froze. It didn't move. Then it wasn't there. Not a trick of the light, not a reflection, just absence. I began noticing patterns in the nocturnal sounds as well. The frogs and insects seemed to stop when I focused on them, then resumed, delayed, like the swamp was testing my attention. Once, while checking trail markers, I found one out of place, not new, not damaged, just reversed. The writing I had done months before faced backward. My handwriting, my dates wrong by weeks. My notes didn't match. I left it, fearing to disturb it further. Harlan didn't mention it when I showed him later. He only said, "Pay attention to the patterns, not the markers." That night, the whispers came again. Not words, but syllables of my own speech from the morning, repeated and stretched in a way that made my stomach tighten. I stayed alert until dawn, flashlight and hatchet in hand, eyes scanning every shadow. When the first light hit the cypress knees, I felt the weight lift slightly. The swamp had taken notice and released, temporarily. On the 7th night, the first real acceleration of events began. I heard the water move unnaturally, like it was forming channels beneath the surface. Footsteps that weren't mine echoed from somewhere deep in the swamp, though my path was empty. I glimpsed shapes moving against the reflection of moonlight on still water, limbs too long, angles unnatural. The feeling of being observed became sharper, almost tactile, pressing against my senses like fog. I made it to the old observation tower and climbed, trying to get perspective. From above, the swamp looked normal at first, but slowly, shapes shifted where they shouldn't have been. Trees leaned into trails, shadows thickened unnaturally. The radio crackled with distorted fragments of conversation I hadn't had, words I didn't recognize. My pulse hammered. I turned to retreat, and for the first time I felt a presence move deliberately in the air around me, circling, testing, waiting. Something had taken interest. It didn't approach. It didn't reveal itself. It simply let me know it knew I was there. I spent the rest of the night in the tower, flashlight sweeping the edges, waiting for dawn, knowing that what I'd stepped into wasn't just a swamp. It was a test, and I was already part of it. The next few nights became exercises in attention. I began cataloging every detail, the pitch of frog calls, the timing of insect chirps, the subtle shifts in water levels. Each anomaly became a signal, and I learned to follow them without looking too closely. Sometimes I would find small objects out of place, a hatchet lodged in a tree trunk backward, a marker sign I had set upright, leaning, moss peeled in patterns I didn't recall leaving. Once I heard footsteps in the mud behind me. I stopped, listened. They didn't move closer, but the sound persisted, circling as though deciding whether I was worthy of notice. I didn't run, I didn't call out, I just waited. Hours passed with no further movement, then silence. The swamp had returned to its usual rhythm, but I knew it had been testing me. My dreams began to carry fragments of its presence. I would awaken hearing water sloshing where no water existed, whispers curling through my bedroom like smoke. Objects in my home shifted slightly, books not on the same shelf, notes I didn't write scratched into my notebooks. I didn't tell anyone. Harlan didn't ask. It was understood that Cypress Hollow had its own memory, and now I was learning what it required from those who entered. By the 10th night, the changes were more pronounced. My equipment began to fail in inexplicable ways.
Radios emitted distorted voices, GPS units misaligned by yards. Lights flickered without cause. I noticed movement at the periphery, branches bending unnaturally, leaves rustling without wind, shadows shifting independently of tree trunks. One night I followed a trail I had walked 100 times, and yet it led me to a clearing I didn't recognize. The trees there arched inward, enclosing me in a half-circle of damp wood. A low hum filled the air, not mechanical, not animal, just present. I tried to retreat, but the path seemed subtly altered. My own tracks didn't line up with the ground as they should have. It was as if the swamp remembered differently than I did. And then I heard it, a sound at the edge of comprehension, like someone trying to imitate my own breathing, deliberate but wrong. My pulse jumped, and I gripped my flashlight tighter. I didn't turn. I knew if I did, I would glimpse something I couldn't unsee. Instead, I moved backward slowly, retracing my steps, aware that every second of attention was noted, measured, stored.
Sleep became impossible. Even in daylight, I felt watched. Shapes lurked in the mist, vanishing when I approached. I began mapping the swamp in new ways, noting invisible boundaries, subtle cues in water movement, and patterns in the wildlife's behavior. Birds avoided areas I planned to traverse. Frogs fell silent when I lingered too long. Insects moved in deliberate clusters. Harlan spoke rarely, offering cryptic advice. Respect the rhythm. Don't push. I tried to translate that into practice, adjusting my patrols, keeping to raised paths, and minimizing interference. But the presence lingered. I saw shadows too long, too angular, too deliberate to be natural. Once, while checking a water gauge near the southern perimeter, I glimpsed something at the tree line. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bent at wrong angles. It didn't move closer, didn't retreat. It simply observed, mirrored the swamp's patience. My hands shook. I forced myself to continue measurements, careful not to make noise, careful not to invite attention. But the knowledge was unavoidable. Whatever lived here was aware of me. It didn't hunt. It didn't speak. It waited, cataloging every motion, every breath.
The deeper into the hollow I went, the more subtle the signs became. Disturbances in mud that smoothed themselves behind me, ripples in stagnant pools that weren't caused by wind, the faint echoes of footsteps that didn't belong to me. One evening, while checking a small side trail that branched off the boardwalk, I noticed moss scraped away in deliberate lines. My first instinct was to assume animal activity, but the marks were angular, precise, and repeated at irregular intervals. I followed them for several yards, my flashlight beam cutting through dense fog. A shape, tall, thin, and impossibly still, appeared briefly between the trees. When I blinked, it was gone. My chest tightened. I recorded the GPS coordinates, made notes about tree orientation, and retreated to the main trail. That night, back at the ranger cabin, I dreamt of the swamp. I walked along paths I hadn't taken yet, hearing whispers I didn't recognize. A reflection of myself stared from a dark pool, mimicking my movements, but delayed. I woke sweating. The radio was on the table, static, crackling, repeating my own voice from earlier patrols. I realized the swamp was not just observing, it was cataloging me, learning my patterns, responding in ways I couldn't control. Each day, the ordinary sounds of frogs and insects seemed to pause when I focused too closely, resuming only when I looked away. I began sleeping fully clothed, hatchet and flashlight within reach, though nothing ever physically attacked me. The pressure was psychological, omnipresent, like the swamp itself exhaling through the fog. I started leaving small markers,
subtle things to test if the space could be influenced. Some disappeared, others were rearranged. Patterns emerged, but no understanding followed. The presence remained just beyond comprehension, patient, persistent, waiting.
On the 10th night, the tension shifted. I heard the first unmistakable movement near me, not just echoes or anomalies, but something deliberate. I followed a minor waterway, flashlight glinting on cypress knees, noting changes in the mud and leaves. A branch cracked ahead, small at first, then another. I froze. The air thickened. My own breath seemed too loud. Then a shadow moved at the edge of my light. A figure, tall and thin, moving with unnatural grace. It didn't approach or retreat, simply shifted with the environment, blending with fog and foliage. I raised my hatchet, heart pounding, and spoke aloud, my voice cracking. No response, only the subtle rustle of leaves and water. I realized then that the creature wasn't interested in confrontation. It was observation. My own anxiety and movements provided more entertainment than fear alone could. Later, I retraced the path, the swamp rearranging subtly behind me. Footprints vanished, plants seemed to shift position, and water pooled differently. Each time I paused, I felt that patient gaze at my back, and sometimes, faintly, a whisper that carried no recognizable words, only intonation and rhythm that mimicked my own speech. Sleep became fragmented. The sounds in the cabin at night, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of air, the subtle drip of water, felt deliberate, extensions of the presence outside. Even in daylight I felt it, watching, cataloging, learning. I began leaving notes, small symbols, marks along the boardwalk, trying to communicate, to test it. Some marks persisted, others were gone the next morning. Always subtle, always deliberate, always precise. The swamp had rules I had not yet learned.
I began to notice the patterns in how wildlife responded. Birds avoided areas where I paused too long. Insects fell silent as I approached. Fish beneath the water's surface scattered in ways that didn't correspond to my footsteps. I experimented with small movements, testing the presence's reaction. One night, I threw a stick into the water and watched as the ripples behaved unnaturally, coiling against the current instead of following it. A reflection in the water that wasn't mine flickered briefly, then disappeared. That was the first time I felt truly unsettled. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. I was not the only intelligence in this place. I walked the perimeter of a small cypress cluster, noting shifts in mud and water. My flashlight caught a glimpse of the figure again. Tall, angular, its movements almost human, but impossible. The swamp itself seemed to adjust around it, amplifying its presence while hiding its form. I wanted to record it, capture it for evidence, but every attempt failed. Cameras malfunctioned, phones died, GPS signals warped. Every tool I brought was ineffective. I realized that the swamp and the presence were intertwined, that technology could not capture this. Only observation, only attention could hint at its form. I began staying longer on patrols, letting the weight settle, learning to recognize the subtle cues, the twitch of a leaf, the pause of an insect, the way water moved in pools. I couldn't confront it. I couldn't escape it. All I could do was endure, watch, and take careful notes, hoping that understanding would come before it demanded something I wasn't prepared to give. The following nights, I began noticing the subtle rearrangement of familiar landmarks. A log I had crossed hundreds of times appeared angled differently. A boardwalk marker I had nailed upright now leaned slightly toward the swamp, as though bowing to some unseen authority. Even the small puddles along the path shifted,
like they had been displaced by invisible hands. My senses sharpened. Every sound, every rustle, every ripple became a clue. Once I caught a faint silhouette in my peripheral vision, tall, impossibly thin, limbs bending unnaturally. But when I turned, it vanished. The swamp remained silent, watching, cataloging, patient. I stopped leaving markers or trying to communicate. It wasn't interested in dialogue. I began to record everything in a journal, cataloging changes in the mud, water, flora, and sounds. Sometimes I felt I could sense it moving through the fog just beyond the flashlight's beam, adjusting its proximity, testing my attention. One night, while checking water gauges, I felt a presence behind me that didn't match any reflection, any shadow. My pulse jumped. I froze. A faint whisper tickled my ear, almost repeating my own thoughts, but wrong, distorted. I forced myself to walk forward slowly, careful not to provoke. The swamp had rules I couldn't yet decipher. Harlan's words echoed, "Respect the rhythm. Don't push." I began seeing his advice not as guidance, but as survival instruction. By the end of the week, my sense of time had warped. Days and nights blended. The fog carried fragments of past patrols, my own echoes, and the presence that never moved fully into sight, but never left either. I realized that this was a game of endurance, of observation, of restraint. The 11th night, I ventured deeper into the marshes than before, following a narrow channel that twisted unpredictably. My flashlight barely penetrated the mist, revealing only gnarled cypress roots and faintly glowing fungi. I began noticing patterns in the natural sounds, the frogs, the crickets, the occasional bird call, pausing in precise intervals when I stepped into certain zones. It was deliberate. Someone or something was orchestrating this environment. I stopped at a small clearing, chest heaving, noticing footprints I didn't recognize pressed into the mud. They were elongated, unnaturally thin, yet unmistakably deliberate. I followed them a few steps before the tracks vanished, leaving only disturbed mud behind. My radio emitted faint, distorted fragments of my own voice from earlier that day, drawn out and warped. I crouched low, scanning the mist. Movement at the edge of perception flickered in and out, a shadow detaching itself from the background, limbs bending wrong, angular, too deliberate. My instinct screamed to retreat, but curiosity held me in place. The swamp was no longer a neutral environment. It had become a sentient presence, testing, measuring, assessing me. I recorded every detail in my journal, hands trembling. The longer I stayed, the more aware I became that it was learning me as much as I was trying to understand it. Every hesitation, every glance, every pause was catalogued. Even as I finally began retracing my steps to the boardwalk, I felt it shift behind me, patient, deliberate, waiting. The fog rolled in thicker, obscuring my path. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I realized I was still within its territory, still under observation, and that nothing I did so far had earned me any favor. By the 12th night, exhaustion had become a constant companion. The swamp had shifted imperceptibly while I rested, rearranging familiar paths, displacing plants and mud in subtle ways. I caught glimpses again, shapes bending through the fog, reflections in water that weren't mine, shadows that didn't align with light sources. At times, I thought I saw it closer, just beyond the beam of my flashlight, mimicking my movements, measuring, cataloging. I kept to the boardwalk now, moving deliberately, noting every irregularity. A low hum filled the air intermittently, unidentifiable but unnervingly deliberate. My radio remained unreliable. Voices repeated fragments of my own speech. I realized then that this creature, this presence, wasn't hunting. It wasn't violent. It was testing me, observing patterns, ensuring I followed its unspoken rules. My journal became my anchor, cataloging every anomaly, every movement, every sound. By dawn, I understood that I had become part of the swamp's memory, recorded in subtle ways that would persist long after I left. I didn't confront it. I didn't name it. I simply endured, moved carefully, and recorded. The swamp had its rhythm. I had adapted. And though the fear was constant, I felt a cautious respect for the intelligence I could not see, but could sense. I knew the longer I stayed, the more entwined I became, and that leaving unprepared could be catastrophic.
The swamp had begun to feel like a living entity with memory. I noticed subtle signs that it remembered me, my movements, my pauses. Fallen branches shifted slightly overnight, forming faint directional patterns I hadn't left. My own footprints appeared less clear than expected, as though the earth itself was correcting them. I started experimenting, leaving false trails to see if the swamp responded. It did. Branches would collapse where I hadn't stepped, mud would shift in ways that erased my attempts at deception. I was being observed constantly. Shadows stretched and twisted at the edges of my vision. Once I thought I glimpsed a figure moving across the clearing, a tall, angular shape, unnaturally thin, walking in impossible silence. When I blinked, it was gone. My heartbeat pounded as I considered the possibility that it wasn't bound by physical laws in the same way I was. Each night I tested myself, pausing, stepping, retreating deliberately. Every choice seemed catalogued, every hesitation noted. The creature wasn't hunting yet, it wasn't aggressive, it was patient, and it was learning. I began sleeping lightly, flashlight by my side, hatchet within reach, journal open on the table. The air itself seemed to carry its presence, subtle, constant, pressing against my awareness like water seeping through clothing. I realized I couldn't fight or flee yet. The swamp controlled both. All I could do was survive, observe, and respect the rhythm it demanded.
On the 15th night, the tension escalated. I moved deeper into a section of the swamp I had avoided until now, a cluster of cypress knees rising from dark water. The fog was denser here, muffling my footsteps and swallowing my flashlight beam almost entirely. I noticed shapes moving at the edges, angular and deliberate. I stopped, heart pounding, sensing their presence. The water rippled unnaturally, though there was no wind. The air thickened, heavy with expectation. A branch snapped behind me, and I spun around. Nothing, just the fog, just the shadows that didn't align. My breathing was loud. I whispered my own name, and the echo returned warped, delayed, stretched in a way that made my skin crawl. Something was close, not attacking, not speaking, just present, patient, deliberate. I backed away slowly, avoiding sudden movements, trying not to draw attention. My journal remained open on the boardwalk earlier that day, its notes meticulous. Every observation, every shift, every irregularity catalogued. I realized then that the swamp itself was a participant, that it recorded and remembered, and that the creature was its extension. It did not need to be seen fully to exert influence. It was subtle, slow, deliberate, and terrifying in its invisibility. By the time I returned to the main trail, my muscles were stiff, my mind alert, my journal filled with new anomalies. I understood that this was a test of endurance, observation, and patience,
and I was learning the rules too slowly for comfort.
By the 16th night, my senses were sharper than ever. The swamp responded to me, shifted subtly as I moved, creating paths I didn't remember forming. My footprints vanished, leaves rearranged, water pooled differently. I noticed a figure at the edge of a clearing again, tall, thin, angular, blending seamlessly with the fog and trees. It mirrored the environment rather than moving naturally, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't exist. I kept my distance, heart hammering, flashlight sweeping the clearing, but never lingering too long. The swamp itself seemed to pulse with awareness, every movement measured, every pause noted. My journal had become both record and anchor, keeping my mind tethered to reality. The whispers continued, my own voice distorted, elongated, repeating phrases I had thought I'd spoken in daylight. Each time I paused, I felt it around me, circling, testing, learning. I realized fully that I had entered a space not bound by ordinary rules, and that understanding the rhythm was the only path to survival. I could not confront it. I could not escape it yet. All I could do was move carefully, observe deliberately, and endure the patient presence that waited just beyond the edge of vision, cataloging every heartbeat, every breath, every step I took.
By the 17th night, my mind was constantly alert, every sense trained to pick up the slightest irregularity. The swamp had become a living labyrinth, constantly shifting, always observing. I noticed patterns in the mud, shapes too regular, angles too precise, as if someone or something was arranging them deliberately. My flashlight illuminated twisted cypress roots that weren't where they had been the day before. I froze when I heard something heavy moving in the water, a slow sloshing that didn't correspond to my path or the wind. I turned sharply, shining the light toward the movement. Nothing, just the fog, the distorted reflections, and that ever-present feeling of being watched. A faint whisper carried on the damp night air, not words I could recognize, but tones and syllables eerily like my own voice. I tightened my grip on my hatchet, took a slow step back, and listened. The swamp didn't respond aggressively. It simply waited, patient, deliberate. My journal had become my lifeline, and I scribbled notes furiously. Every irregularity, every ripple, every shadow, every whispered sound. I was beginning to understand the rules, slowly, painfully. The swamp didn't punish, it only tested. I couldn't see the creature fully yet, but I could feel its presence in every shift of fog, every ripple of water, every subtle rearrangement of the earth beneath my boots. My pulse remained high, my mind raced, cataloging patterns I wasn't sure I fully understood.
The 18th night brought the first real confrontation with my own fears. While following a narrow channel deeper into the hollow, I saw movement at the edge of my flashlight's beam. A figure, tall, angular, thin, emerged from the fog, standing perfectly still. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, its posture fluid yet unnatural. I froze, heart pounding. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken awareness. I wanted to run, but my instincts told me that sudden movements would provoke observation. I breathed slowly, trying to keep calm, keeping the light fixed on the area where it had been. When I shifted my eyes even slightly, the shape had vanished, replaced by nothing but fog and the reflection of the moon on water. My pulse thundered in my ears. The swamp had orchestrated this encounter, testing patience, endurance, and attention. I took careful notes, mapping the exact location, time, wind direction, and fog density. Every instinct screamed at me that I had been marked, cataloged, noted. The whispers followed me back to the boardwalk,
fragments of my own voice repeating endlessly through the fog. I slept fitfully that night, half listening to the subtle movement of water, every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves keeping me on edge. The presence was patient, unrelenting, constant. I realized fully that this swamp and whatever inhabited it did not operate by ordinary rules. Survival required observation, caution, and restraint.
The 19th night, the swamp's lessons became clearer. I began to anticipate its subtle signals, a sudden pause in insect sounds, a frog ceasing its call, a leaf twitching without wind. Every movement and stillness carried meaning. I noticed footprints again, elongated, thin, precise, but always disappearing before I could fully trace them. A reflection in a small pool rippled, unnaturally, revealing the slightest silhouette of something watching me from just beyond vision. I did not approach. I waited, recorded, and observed. My journal overflowed with notes, sketches, maps, and observations. The swamp seemed to respond to my awareness, testing and adjusting. Once I felt the air move against my cheek as if someone brushed past, but nothing was there. Every instinct told me that the creature was near, measuring, learning, cataloging. The tension escalated not through attack, but through awareness, the sense that I was under observation, fully visible to something I could not see. I walked slowly, deliberately, documenting anomalies in mud, water, and foliage. I slept lightly, leaving hatchet and flashlight within reach. Every sound, every whisper, every subtle movement became a message. By dawn, I realized that survival in Cypress Hollow depended not on confrontation, but on respect, patience, and meticulous observation.
By the 20th night, I was exhausted, but my awareness had sharpened beyond normal limits. Every subtle cue in the swamp felt like communication. Twisted branches, shifting mud, ripples in still water, they all carried intent. I followed a narrow, twisting channel, flashlight beam cutting through dense fog, and noticed movement again. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, angular and impossibly tall. I froze, breathing shallow, heart hammering. The figure didn't step closer, it simply mirrored the environment, blending with trees and fog. I thought I glimpsed limbs bending inhumanly, but it dissolved when I tried to focus. My journal became my lifeline, every observation, every irregularity meticulously recorded. I began noticing subtler changes in the natural sounds around me. Birds paused mid-call, frogs fell silent, insects stopped chirping. Each pause, I realized, marked zones of its presence. I dared not move quickly, knowing that sudden actions would draw attention. The swamp wasn't hunting, not yet. It was testing endurance, patience, and caution. By dawn, I had mapped several areas where its influence was strongest, learning to anticipate its presence without confronting it. Each step I took reinforced a growing understanding. I had entered a space that didn't operate under ordinary rules. The swamp, and whatever intelligence inhabited it, measured my every action, cataloged every hesitation, and waited.
On the 21st night, the encounter became more tangible. Following the eastern perimeter of the hollow, I saw a figure again. It was partially visible now, a silhouette bending unnaturally, limbs too long, angles impossible. The fog swirled around it, masking details, but I could sense its deliberate observation. I stayed still, flashlight fixed on the clearing, recording notes in my mind. Its presence pressed against my awareness, patient and deliberate. I noticed patterns in its behavior, small shifts in fog, subtle rearrangement of foliage, timing of sounds, all coordinated. It mimicked movement without mimicking fully, a distortion of what I knew. I didn't move closer. I didn't speak. I simply observed, heart racing, sweat chilling my back. The whispers followed me, fragments of my own voice stretched and warped, carrying intonation I hadn't intended. Every instinct screamed that the swamp and the creature were intertwined, that survival depended on observation, restraint, and respect. My journal overflowed with notes on footprints, water ripples, and movement patterns. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was certain the swamp and its unseen intelligence weren't violent in the conventional sense. They were patient, adaptive, and immensely intelligent. My sleep that night was light, every sound amplified, every